it's unfortunate that my German is not sufficient yet for lecturing, so this lecture, if there will be following, will be in English. I hope that maybe by the end of my 2-year stay here, I'll be able to lecture also in German, but not yet. Anyway, today's lecture is about, as Oren said, the Jewish roots of Christianity, but it's actually it's more than that. It's about ancient Judaism, the Jewish matrix of Christianity, the birth of Christianity, and its final separation from Judaism, what is now called the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. So it's a huge topic, and dozens of books, hundreds of books have been written on this topic, and books continue to be written, and people continue to argue about what really happened, how it happened, and why Judaism and Christianity finally parted ways. So the Jewish origins of Christianity is something that's now taken for granted by scholars, and people who are not out of their minds do not question the fact that Christianity emerged out of Judaism. And sometimes, of course, you meet all kinds of scholars who will claim that Jesus wasn't a Jew, but he was a mushroom, or and that's serious, yeah. Or that there was a guy at Tel Aviv University who died several years ago, a professor of Jewish history, Yoshua Efron, who claimed that this whole story that Judaism emerged out of Christianity is a late fake. So Christians invented at the end of the first century this whole pedigree as though they belonged to Judaism, but it's a lie. But this is not serious. So everybody takes for granted that Judaism emerged out of Christianity. Now the question, how it happened? The question is how it happened, why it happened, and why finally we have two religions instead of one. Until recently, this whole thing of Judeo-Christian dialogue, which is very popular in the last years, is a relatively new thing, because until the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel, it's very difficult to describe interaction between Jews and Christians as Judeo-Christian dialogue, but it was rather Judeo-Christian polemics. Why Holocaust and the State of Israel changed everything, at least in the West, is rather clear, because when conscientious people in the West began to question this whole thing of the big question of how Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism contributed to the Nazi genocide, and since it was clear that there were at least some connections, many Christian scholars began to develop different ways of looking at Judaism and studying it. Judaism was not, almost wasn't studied by Christian scholars in its own right until the end of the Second World War. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. First, in pre-war German scholarship, ancient Judaism, which is 2,000 years old, was named Spätjudentum. Why Spätjudentum? Because it was kind of, that was late Judaism out of which Christianity emerged. Everything that was later was not even counted as worth of being studied, maybe only for the purpose of polemics. But the funny thing is that after the war, Spätjudentum miraculously became Frühjudentum. So now if you read the German scholarship on the subject, Judaism that was named the Spätjudentum is now Frühjudentum. Anyway, and just to give a couple of more examples, one of the most important tools for the study of the New Testament, scholarly tools, is what is called in German Theologisches Wörterbuch zum Neuen Testament. There is also an English translation. It's a massive work. It's like 6 volumes in English at least. This thick. That's probably the most important and the most consulted work on the meaning of the words in the New Testament, Greek words. But much of it has to do with Judaism, since the background of the usage of these words in the New Testament is inevitably Jewish, like the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and other Jewish literature from the turn of the Common Era. Now, the guy who initiated the project and the guy who stood at the head of the project, the editor, his name is Gerhard Kittel. Gerhard Kittel was a member of the Nazi Party. He was the official theologian of the Third Reich, and probably no other theologian contributed more to the theological underpinnings of the final solution than Gerhard Kittel. And this is something that he didn't edit the whole work, because the work was written between 1933 and 1977, so a long time after Kittel was gone. But the beginnings of the project and its initial stages were supervised by Kittel. But it is just one example. So these are people who worked on ancient Judaism and wrote books about how Christianity emerged and things like that. Anyway, now it's mostly a thing of the past, fortunately. And I forgot to say one thing: the Jewish scholars were not also able to, without prejudice, to look at these things, because they were fighting for their lives. And they also were apologetic, because they had to defend Judaism from the fierce anti-Semitic attacks from the side of the Christian theologians. So after the war, they said things changed. Also, very important archaeological discoveries were made, like the discovery of the Qumran scrolls, and many things became different from how they were perceived before. Judaism. People realized that Judaism was not monolithic. It wasn't one thing. It was a very diverse phenomenon. And in this way, now people try to understand the origins of Christianity. Now, another thing that I need to say is that at the moment, people used to think that the paradigm goes like this: that there was a Judaism, which was like a mother, and then there was a Christianity, which is like a daughter. Okay? So the mother continued to exist, and it went on. Now scholars have discarded this paradigm, and the normal view now is that you don't have a mother and one daughter, you have a mother and you have 2 daughters. And the mother is the Judaism of the Second Temple, which is different in many ways, both from Christianity and from Rabbinic Judaism, which is a bit later. So now you have one mother and 2 daughters, Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Each one of them took something from the mother and discarded other things. Okay, but the process is now viewed like this. So now I'll begin to get more into the background and what happened and how it happened. Well, the emergence of Christianity cannot be discussed outside of the context of the Hellenization of Judaism. That is Greek influences, but not exactly Greek, because we're not talking here about really Greeks. We're talking about Macedonians, and we're talking about their mixture with Oriental elements. That's what is usually understood to be the process of Hellenization. And it's not that only the Jews were influenced by it. The whole Near East came under the influence of Greek thought. So the Jews, just like the Syrians or the Egyptians, or people of Asia Minor, were Hellenized. And earlier, scholars thought that only the Judaism of the diaspora was Hellenized. But now it's understood that the Jews in Judea, which also was part of this big Hellenistic world, they also underwent this process of Hellenization. Why is it important? It's important because it's undeniable that Christianity is a mixed phenomenon. So on the one hand, it's recognizably Jewish, early Christianity. On the other hand, it's also permeated by Hellenistic influences. So all of the books of the New Testament, as we have them now, were written in Greek. But at the same time, there were many other Jewish books which did not make into the Hebrew Bible, which were written in Greek, precisely for that purpose. But Jews were writing literature, religious literature in Greek. And Jews were reading Torah in Greek, and that was normal, even in the land of Israel, like in Caesarea, for example. The primary language of the second most important figure in early Christianity, Apostle Paul, was Greek. That was his mother tongue. And his letters are written in Greek, which is not so bad. So what I'm trying to say is that this process was very important, in the sense that in the context of this process, many Greek ideas or mixed ideas, Greek and Oriental, came over into Judaism, and this is basically undeniable. So it's now scholars realize that not only the Judaism of the diaspora, or generally of the land of Israel, it came under these influences, but also the rabbinic Judaism itself should be seen as heavily Hellenized. And the rabbis themselves, as a social class, should be called philosophers. I mean, that was the equivalent of a Greek philosopher in Jewish society. So that's what I'm trying to say, that just to understand why sometimes Christianity looks so different from Judaism. Well, actually, it should be taken in context of that period and not what we know later. Okay. I'll now get more into history. My next lecture, and I hope it will take place, will be about the Maccabees, or about the Hasmonean revolt and the books of Maccabees. So this was a very important period in Jewish history. Actually, it was probably one of the most important periods in Jewish history since antiquity until our own days. When in 1968, the Seleucid monarch, that was the empire that ruled the land of Israel at that time, Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes, they prescribed the practice of Judaism. 168 BCE. No, I said 19, sorry. Well, it happened sometimes. Anyway, why he did it is a big question, and I hope to address it in the next lecture. Not that people know for sure, but there are several ideas why. Anyway, this thing was opposed by a priestly family of the Hasmoneans who started a revolt, and it was a very long, this whole thing is a very long story, but I'll make it short because we don't have enough time. But anyway, finally they achieved independence, both religious and political, from the Seleucid Empire, and in 142 BCE established an independent Jewish state. And this state lasted until 63 BCE. So that's a rather long period, that's almost 100 years. On the one hand, we can say we would expect the Jews to be happy because now they have a local dynasty, they have independence, there is a territorial expansion and things like that. But not all Jews were happy, because some of them considered the Hasmoneans to be usurpers, because they did not. They finally also proclaimed themselves kings, and they were not from the house of David, and even their priestly background was under big question. I mean, nobody argued that they were priests, but they were not from the family of the priest, not from that family that supplied the priest since the high priest since the days of King David. At least that's what people believe. So they had a lot of opponents, and we think that in that period Jewish sectarianism began. We don't know exactly when, but the major sects of Second Temple Judaism, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, we hear about them for the first time during this period, during the period of the Hasmoneans. And we know that some of them had very serious problems with the Hasmoneans. Like the later Hasmoneans persecuted the Pharisees, they killed hundreds of them, many of them were forced to immigrate. We know that the Qumran sect, which is usually identified with these scenes, went into a self-imposed exile, and they hated the Hasmoneans. But what is more important is that at this period, we begin to witness some messianic aspirations. So, in contrast to what people usually think, and they think it this way because of the role of the Messiah in later Judaism, like Rabbinic Judaism and medieval Judaism, but the concept of the Messiah was not a very prominent one in Second Temple Judaism. We have about 5, excluding the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, we probably have about 5 compositions out of dozens, probably about 100 that survived, that mention the Messiah. So the Messiah was not a great concept, and it was not a very popular one. But it appeared. I mean, it's attested mainly. Well, it's in the Bible, but in the Bible it's a different thing. What I mean is that the Messiah, as we now think of him, or there were sometimes 2 messiahs, like in Qumran. This idea appears first in the literature of the Hasmonean period, and probably in opposition to them, because those people who were opposed to them, they did not like their rule. They waited for a descendant of King David that will come and release them from these wicked people and initiate a new glorious age in the history of the Jewish people. Anyway, this is important for the New Testament, but I'll go back to it later. So now, after the Hasmoneans came the Romans. The Romans came in 63 BCE, and they annexed Judea, and they appointed Herod the Great to the Jewish throne. I won't get into this whole business with Herod the Great, who he was he bad, was he good, but in the contemporary sources, he is described as a wicked beast. Okay. We find it in the sources, we don't find much evidence that he was so evil, or so aggressive, or cruel. I mean, we don't have facts, okay? We just have statements like he was evil. But we know that in this period appear all kinds of books, Jewish books, whose authors reject the concept of an earthly Messiah, and they begin to speak about a heavenly Messiah. Probably life was so bad for them, or they perceived it in this way, that they didn't want, the earth to be a kind of reform. They wanted to live in a different dimension in heavens or things like that. Okay, so, and I can read you a short passage from one such composition. It's the first book of Enoch. The first book of Enoch was found at Qumran in Aramaic, not all of it, but portions of it. But it's a very important Jewish work. It's composite in nature. It was written over many decades, even hundreds of years. And this is the quotation from the latest part, which was probably written in Herod's period. And Enoch was a biblical patriarch. The Bible says in the book of Genesis that he walked with God, and God took him. He walked with God, and then suddenly he was not, because God took him. That's it. We don't know what happened, but this whole literature, because this is not the only book of Enoch, there are 3 of them at least. One in Hebrew. I mean, we have it in Hebrew because it's from the Rabbinic period. This Enoch became a leading personage in this type of Judaism, to the degree that some scholars now speak of so-called Enochic Judaism. They think that at the time of Jesus, besides Judaism that venerated Moses as its major figure, there was transcendent Judaism which venerated Enoch as the main figure, because you can find Moses in these books, okay? But Enoch is a major figure. He is a legislator. He is a mediator of divine blessings and secrets and halakha and all kinds of things. Anyway, and as you will see here, he is the Messiah. So I read from this part. And in that hour that Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his name before the head of days. Even before the sun and the constellations were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. Etc., etc. For this reason he was chosen and hidden in his presence, in God's presence, before the world was created and forever. So Enoch was created before the world, he is pre-existent, he is the Savior, etc., etc. And he is called the Messiah, Anointed One. For the Chosen One has taken his stand in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his glory is forever and ever, and his might to all generations. And in him dwell the spirit of wisdom and the spirit of insight, and the spirit of instruction and might, and the spirit of those who have fallen asleep in righteousness. And it goes on and on and on. And the Chosen One in those days, in the later days, will sit upon my throne, he will sit on God's throne, and all the secrets of wisdom will go forth from the counsel of his mouth, for the Lord of Spirits has given them to him and glorified him. And I can go on forever with this book. Okay. And he's named the Messiah, and finally God basically tells Enoch, this is all about you. You are the Messiah. You are the Chosen One, and etc. So, we know that the book of Enoch was known to early Christian authors, since it is quoted in the New Testament as scripture. It is quoted in the Epistle of Jude, from the first chapter is quoted and referred to as the Holy Scripture. So it is not too far-fetched to suppose that this business about the Son of Man and the Messiah and all this blah 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 was known to Jesus, and it influenced his self-awareness too. But this is just one example, okay? We know that the Qumran people venerated, they expected two messiahs. They expected the Messiah of Israel, which was probably a Davidic king, and the Messiah of Aaron, because they didn't like this whole idea of the Hasmoneans uniting two powers, the priestly and the royal. So they, even in the later days, they wanted to separate them. So there wouldn't be one ruler, there will be two eschatological messiahs. What I'm trying to say is that there was no concept of the Messiah. It's not that there was like a messianic idea in Judaism, which was common to everybody. As I said, there's just a handful of writings that mention the Messiah, and the question now is why in the world the early Christians at all decided to stick this title to Jesus, because there were many other mythological titles, even more popular, and there were other eschatological scenarios in which there were other agents of divine salvation or deliverance which were named differently, like a heavenly priest, or Melchizedek, or Archangel Michael, or divine wisdom. There were non-messianic scenarios of how the world would be redeemed or at least reformed. So this is a big question. Now I'll just one important thing is that when we look at the New Testament and the various writings which are now included in it, we see that Jesus is portrayed differently in various writings. Like, for example, and I will come to it later. Like in the Gospel of Matthew, he is the second Moses. Okay, in the Gospel of John, he is the pre-existent Logos, which is translated as the Word. Okay, but it's a much more complex idea. Or for Paul, he is the heavenly Lord. Okay, and the personification of divine wisdom. For the author of the Gospel of the Apocalypse of John, he is the divine judge, apocalyptic judge that is mounted on a horse and kills his enemies with the sword of his mouth and things like that. That's far from Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, but you have all these different things, okay? Or Melchizedek, he's a Melchizedek, for example, priest. He's a high priest, although he's from he's kind of he's the Messiah, son of David, so he can't be a priest because he's not from Aaron. But then in the epistle to the Hebrews, he becomes the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So this Melchizedek, who is mentioned twice in the Bible, becomes in Second Temple period also a very big shot, like almost like Enoch. He's also called God, and I'll go to it now. So what I'm trying to say is that these whole images, which were kind of put on Jesus by the early Christians, they already existed in Second Temple Judaism. And many of the stories that are told about Jesus, although in the context of Judaism as we know it, like rabbinic Judaism, they sound strange, like this, birth from God, for example. Yeah, it sounds kind of very un-Jewish, but I can demonstrate it to you that for the Second Temple Jews, that was a normal thing that happened on a daily basis. So women got pregnant from angels and from God, Not only that, Philo the Alexandrian, the great Jewish philosopher, he writes that he says, Adonai pakadet Sarah. The Lord visited Sarah. How do you think he visited her? He says, but it's not only this. Of course, this is a big mystery. I mean, it's clear for him that Isaac and Jacob, they're all born from God. But not only that, he says that when man sleeps with a maiden, she becomes a woman. But when God visits a woman, she goes back to being a virgin. And if you think I'm joking, this is you find it all over the place. I mean, this whole business with giants, who were born from, angels copulating with women. It's a big business in Second Temple Judaism. You don't find Adam and Eve. Those guys thought that all evil on earth was from those giants, because in Genesis 6, at the beginning, it says that there were angels who came down to earth and they copulated with women, and they were at that time heroes in the land. Azayu Giborim Baaretz. So in the books of Enoch, this whole business is developed into a long story of how it really happened, and then those giants were born from the union of angels and fallen angels and women, and those giants were destroyed by God, but out of them came out evil spirits, and these evil spirits drive people crazy and they make them sin. They make people sick. They make people mad. And these are, by the way, the demons that Jesus is casting out. Because you don't find these demons in the Bible. The demonology of the Bible is very, very, very poor. But if you go to Second Temple Judaism, these demons who kind of inhabit human beings, this is the source of all evil. And this is, by the way, why Jesus became so famous, because he was walking around and casting out those demons. But where they came from, that's the story where they came from. Then, I forgot to say, but this Enoch, for example, in the third book of Enoch, which we have in Hebrew, is declared he goes to heaven, and then he's transformed, and God lets him sit on his throne, gives him a scepter and diadem, and proclaims him to be Yahweh Akatan, which is the little Yahweh. Okay? So these things like concerning apotheosis, and you can't argue with this because it's in Hebrew. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is that this mythology, Jewish mythology of the Second Temple period, was very, very, very rich. People think that Jesus went to India and that learned some stuff. I mean, India is, doesn't stand close to what the Jews of the Second Temple period were able to envisage. So this Melchizedek, which I mentioned in the epistle to the Hebrews, there is the second book of Enoch, which is preserved in full only in Old Church Slavonic. I mean, the Jewish literature of the Second Temple period has not survived in Jewish hands. It was copied by Christians. So sometimes, like in this case of the second Enoch, the only full copies are in Slavonic, because they were translated probably from Greek into Slavonic, and that's how they survived. But scholars a couple of years ago found a fragment from the same book on the border between Sudan and Egypt in Coptic. Okay, So that's the excellence of the survival of Jewish literature. Sometimes it's like this. Some tractates of Philo survive only in Armenian. So what I'm trying to say is that in this the second book of Enoch, there's Melchizedek is born without the help of a human father. At the end of the book, there is an appendix where it says that Noah, the biblical Noah, had a brother who was called Nil, and this Nil was the high priest. And since he was appointed to be the high priest, he had not slept with his wife. So then his wife appeared before him, and she had a baby. Okay, so he attacked her and said, I mean, you've been cheating on me. And she said, no, I'm a faithful wife. How can you think things like that? And he said, I'll kill you now, out of jealousy. And she was so ashamed that she fell and died on the spot. Then he wanted to conceal this whole thing. He went to his brother Noah, and they dug a grave, and they wanted to bury her in secret. But when they came to take the body, they saw, and you think that I'm crazy and I'm just making this whole thing up. But I can give you references, and this is just a small thing. And when they came back, they saw that out of her body came like a child who was like a 3-year-old boy, and he had a stamp of high priesthood on his forehead, and he was praising God, and he of course nearly did not understand what happened. So then Archangel Gabriel came and said, "This is Melchizedek, and the Word of God created him inside his mother." Okay, and then he of course praised God and said, "Wonderful." And then Archangel Michael, in another version, it's Gabriel, said, "No, but I'm taking him to heaven because he's going to be a heavenly high priest, and he will be responsible for the heavenly cult there." Now, this is not the only thing, because the people of Qumran also believed that Melchizedek was God. There is a manuscript in Hebrew, which is called by scholars the Pesher Melchizedek. So they also call themselves Anshei Goral Melchizedek. They are people of the destiny of this Melchizedek, who is kind of their leader, and he is called God. Okay, Elohim. Apart from that, this is just like a minor character, but I'm just trying to show, and it's the virtual character. So if you can imagine these things about the virtual character, how much more when you have a charismatic person like Jesus. Okay, so then of course you can invent all kinds of stories about him out of the, this warehouse of Jewish mythology. You can take it and you can use it. So, among other examples, we also know that Moses, in some versions, was divinized. Like Josephus, the great Jewish historian, for example, tells the story that Moses only wrote about himself that he died, because he didn't want the people to say that he went back to the deity. But actually what happened, he said, was to stupid people. People can make all kinds of things. I mean, those who are advanced, it's okay. But, the simple folks, they can, they will do all kinds of strange things. So he said he went into the ravine, and a cloud came and he disappeared. Okay? Now compare this with the story of Jesus' ascension in the Gospel of Luke. That's what exactly he said there. And it's not for nothing, because some people think that the Gospel of Luke, or the author of the Gospel of Luke, knew Jewish antiquities of Josephus. And it of course goes back to the story of Romulus in Roman history. But anyway, you have like a Jewish author from Egypt who is called Ezekiel the tragedian, because he was writing tragedies in a Hellenistic fashion. So he said that Moses ascended to heaven, and God, for such a great guest, dismounted from his throne and gave him his scepter and his diadem, and all the hosts of heaven bowed down to Moses. So God dismounted, Moses mounted. Okay, it's just another story. Another Jew from Egypt, Artapanus, these are all fragments, says that Moses brought civilization to Egypt, and then the locals were so impressed that they divinized him and worshipped him as Hermes. you have compositions, Jewish compositions where, like the prayer of Joseph, it's fragmentary, but you have a story there about the Jewish patriarch Jacob, who says, I am the firstborn of all creation, and I am not like a human being, but I am an angel, like archangel, that descended to earth and tabernacled among men. And the verb that he uses, kataskeno, is the same verb that in the Gospel of John, in the first chapter, in the 14th verse, says that the word, Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. So I'll go back to Logos later. But anyway, and then you have like the prayer of Jacob, another Jewish, it's a spell, it's a magical spell. The Jews were very, very powerful in magic, at least from what we know from literature and from outside witnesses. He says, I am a terrestrial angel, Jacob. I'm not a man, I'm not a son, I'm an angel that lives on earth. So you have all kinds of ideas like that, and don't forget that people came to Jesus and asked him, are you an angel? Are you Jeremiah? Are you Didymus? I mean, kind of, who are you? In fourth book of Maccabees, that's a different story. You have a story about the martyrs, and I will speak about it in the next lecture. The martyrs, this story from second Maccabees, which was taken up in fourth Maccabees, that died for Judaism, and the mother and her 7 sons. So when they are killed, it says that their blood atoned for the sins of the nation. It propitiated God, and by the help of their death, they purified the land and they expelled the enemy. So you have all the elements that you later have about Jesus, like, and his sacrificial death on the cross. And I mean, people don't argue about the Jewish provenance of these works. It's not that people argue about it. It's taken for granted. Then, if you go to Philo, the great Jewish leader of the Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt, that was like Manhattan of our day. I mean, there were probably more Jews in Egypt than in the land of Israel at that time. And he was that was the cultural capital of the world, and this guy was highly educated. And his brother he had the title of Arabarchus, which means the ruler of the Arabs, because he was a custom man. He collected customs from the Arabian trade on the eastern side of the Nile. So that was guy who was like lending money to the emperor. So Philo was very good, very well educated, and he was the leader of the Jewish community of Alexandria, and he was observant. I mean, we know it from his writings that he was very observant, and he criticized Jews that were lax in their observance. So there's no argument about his Jewish loyalty and about his Judaism. But he took this logos from the Greek philosophy, which later made it into the Gospel of John, and we gave like this whole idea that God the Word and the incarnation of Jesus. So for Philo it was an abstract term, and Philo lived before. Philo lived in the probably 20 BCE to something like 50 CE. And he speaks of this logos as the ruler of the universe. He says the logos is the pilot that steers the universe. That logos is the Son of God. Okay? He is the real Serut. He is the Son of God. He existed from before the creation of the world, and even more. He says logos is Odeoteros Theos, which means he is the second God. Although Philo, we know that he was a monotheist, and we don't know exactly what he meant by saying that logos was the second God. But then we don't know what Paul meant when he was referring to Jesus, like Lord, and at the same time claiming that God is one. So those Jews were strange people. But the fact remains that all this stuff is there. and it's there before the beginnings of Christianity. So you have all this mythology, and you have all those bricks out of which the early Christians later constructed the image of their leader, okay, or the person whom they admire. So if you take any title or any idea that is applied to Jesus, I mean, of course there are developments. I'm not saying that early Christians were not original in anything. Definitely they were. I mean, we know that people said like Enoch is God, or people said Moses like is God, okay, or Logos is God, but we don't find traces that people worship them, okay. So maybe it's an accident of survival. We don't know, but we know that we can't prove that people worship Enoch. Well, we know that people worship Jesus, okay, as a divine being. Anyway, so how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Well, okay.
Because maybe we have a few questions.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I'll try to make it short. When you go to the documents themselves, I mean, there's no question again that Jesus existed. There's no question that he attracted crowds, and he had probably that he had 12 disciples, like the core. There were many more, but the core was 12. And we know that he was famous for casting out demons, devils, and healing people. Okay, I mean, whatever that may mean. It's not that I don't believe that people can be healed like that, unless it's something psychosomatical, and that's of course possible.
So he was a wizard at that time, or?
Well, you see, modern scholars, as far as the sociological category is concerned, he fits into the category of a magician. I mean, sociologically. It's not saying something pejorative, because modern scholars do not think that magic is something which is much different from religion. In some ways, it's even smarter. It's more like science, okay, in that way. People used to denigrate magic and say that, and then also, magic is in the eye of the beholder. You have a holy man, but I don't believe in him. So for me, he is a magician. I have a holy man, and you don't believe in him. So for you, he is also a magician. So that's what you find in the New Testament. They accuse each other of magic, but they're doing the same thing.
What I don't understand, where did the bad people come from, or the bad spirits come from? Was it also created by people? I mean,
no,
that were fallen angels.
If you go and read those books, I mean, and you understand in what kind of abysmal ignorance people lived, in what kind of stories people believed, and you also realize the level of science at that time. I mean, people didn't know that they had an epileptic, okay, and that's what you find in Jesus healing epileptics, okay. So they say the guy is demon possessed. They see somebody blind, they say he's blind because there is a demon in him. They see somebody who stammers, they say it's a demon. They see somebody who is crooked, they say it's a demon. So it's kind of it's not like they're going to it's not like today. People didn't have an idea about these things. Why this happens? Or you have a lunatic. Or you have somebody who's crazy. Okay, so then he behaves strangely because he has a demon in him, and this demon has to be cast out. So that's the thing. Now, we know that Jesus antagonized the priestly establishment. Well, he was a hooligan there. I mean, he turned over tables, in the temple. So the high priests were not happy. First, second, there were many these charismatics. Josephus writes about them, and what happened was that they were going to the desert and saying, "Oh, I'm going now to give an order, and the walls of Jerusalem will fall." Or I'm going to strike Jordan, and it's going to part. And then the Romans sent heavy infantry, and killed all those guys. I mean, why? They really believed that he will strike Jordan and it will part. And what did they care about it? Okay, but they knew that there's a potential. There's a potential of beginning a rebellion. Okay. And when there were many people around Jesus, and it doesn't matter that maybe he claimed that his kingdom is not of this world. maybe he claimed that it's somewhere in the heavens or spiritual thing, but people believed that he was a king, a Messiah, okay? And there were crowds around him. So just in order to keep this whole thing from, becoming unmanageable, they kind of tried to, to destroy it in the beginning. And that's how Jesus actually suffered. Josephus gives more examples about people exactly like Jesus or similar to him. John the Baptist was beheaded exactly for the same thing, because there were many people around him. There was a potential of rioting, and so Agrippa, Herod's son, Antipa, decided to imprison him and then finally beheaded him. So this is I mean, here he fits exactly. Now what I'm trying to say, of course, nobody knows what really happened and where Jesus' body disappeared. And here I'll get closer to the end. I had many more things to say, but maybe when you ask questions, it will come up. I'm trying to say that if you look at the early Christian, we have some non-Christian sources about Jesus and his disciples, like Josephus. But Josephus mentions him twice. In one place, it's just a short mention. He says that the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, was executed. And in another place where he was what's called the Flavian Testimonium Flavianum, it's more extensive. He says there was this man Jesus, but it is interpolated by Christians, and that has been proven. I mean, it's proven, it's clear that Josephus mentioned him, but on the other hand, the text as we have it now is heavily interpolated by later Christian copyists. We have other sources like Tacitus, but these are already much later. The main sources, of course, are the Christian ones, the Gospels, okay? But if you compare the Gospels, the first three are similar, okay? And there is an interdependence between them, and the earliest one is Mark. That's the second Gospel, according to the order in the New Testament. The first is Matthew. So, Mark, if you look at it, it's what we could say, it's a primitive Gospel. Not primitive because it's stupid, but just because it's less developed than the other ones. And in it you don't find the virginal conception of Jesus. You don't find that he just appears out of nowhere, and nothing is said about how he was born, and there is no resurrection. So if you look at the end of the Gospel, and in regular editions, they translate some sentences where there is a resurrection. But every scholar in the world knows, and if you look at the critical edition, you see that these passages are marked as later editions. So the Gospel of Mark ends with the story of women coming to the tomb and finding it empty. No, sorry, you found it empty, and then a tremor and ecstasy took hold of them, and they fled because they were afraid, and they didn't tell anything to nobody. That's it. Okay, then you have the Gospels like Matthew and Luke, and they of course developed this whole business concerning how he was born, how he ascended to heaven, how he was resurrected. But if you compare, for example, Matthew with Luke, you will see that the most important source they used, apart from Mark and another one, the source of sayings, was their rich imagination, because the stories do not fit. I mean, here Jesus flees to Egypt, here Jesus goes to the temple when he's born, etc. In Matthew, he tells the disciples after his resurrection to go to Galilee. In Luke, he says, stay in Jerusalem and don't move. So, I mean, you can see the nature of sources. They are problematic. So, but what we do see is that the figure of the founder is getting more and more and more developed, in the sense that all these things that I mentioned, like traditions about Moses Apotheosis, traditions about Enoch, this whole messianic thing, Jewish wisdom traditions, this whole Hellenistic stuff about Logos, virginal conceptions and ascent to heaven. I forgot to say that, for example, the founder of the Qumran community, everybody knows what Qumran is?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, because I mean, anyways, if somebody doesn't know, tell me. That's the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century, because we have their literature written by Jews in the Second Temple period, which did not go through Christian copies and translations. So their leader, whom they call Mohr-Siebeck, which means teacher of righteousness, they also believed him to ascend to heaven, and he himself, there's a composition which scholars call 4Q 492. It's fragmentary, but enough has been preserved in order to understand what it's all about. He says, I went up to heaven and I sit on a heavenly throne. It's the first person narrative. I sit on a heavenly throne, and all these gods are like nothing, because I'm the coolest god, etc., etc. It goes on and on and on. And they themselves, in a different composition, say that God will save them. They quote from Habakkuk, which is "Atzadik be'onato yifyeh," which is in the New Testament 3 times quoted as applying to Jesus. It's "Tzadik be'onato yifyeh," the righteous will live by his faith. They ask, what faith? Faith in Jesus Christ. So the people in Qumran said, it's faith in Mohr-Siebeck. So you find exactly the same verse. And now you can find it probably, sometimes now you find stuff which in the New Testament applies to Jesus is applied to Rebbe Lubavitch, which is a different story. But it's from the same opera. Mm-hmm. It's from the same opera. So these things in Jewish history, they go on repeating themselves. Now there are other questions like why finally Christianity separated from Judaism. So what I'm trying to say is that in this. In my approach, the way I try to present it, Christianity it's like part and parcel of the Jewish world of that period. But there were other processes underway in Christianity, which finally brought about a separation between Judaism and Christianity, and they were both theological and halachic. So one, it's a complex thing. Nobody can, definitely not in one lecture. But it's very difficult. Yeah, I'm finishing. Very difficult to analyze it exhaustively. But there were many different reasons why it happened, and one of the main ones was the sociological, and that has to do with the Apostle Paul, because Apostle Paul created a new social entity. In the churches that he established, he insisted that there is no difference between Jew and Gentile, and that the Gentiles are not supposed to observe the Torah. He never said to the Jews that they have to, they must not observe the Torah. But he insisted on their equality, while other Christians were not so sure. They thought that Jewish believers, Jewish Christians, still have to retain their identity, and they are different from Gentile Christians. Not that they're better or worse, but they have a different destiny. So Paul said no. Paul said we're all together, and erased those boundaries. And at the same time, continued to teach his converts that they are the heirs of the covenant God made with Israel, without submitting to the yoke of the Torah. So that you are like now children of Abraham, you are now the chosen people, you are now the heirs of all the promises, and basically you are Israel. Okay? He doesn't say it, he says in one place Israel of God. Theologians argue what it means, but basically he created this new thing which was different, distinct from Israel, and it claimed all the privileges of Israel. So basically, kind of two Israels were created. Okay, and it's a long story, but basically that was the main thing. That was the main thing because the consequences of what Paul did were catastrophic for Judaism in the long run. I mean, I'm not trying to accuse him and say that he did it on purpose and he was a wicked man and he was evil and things like that. This is not what I'm trying to say. I mean, actually, he was probably thinking that he was a very good Jew. We know that he submitted to Jewish discipline. 5 times he was beaten in the synagogue with 49 stripes, and people can die of it. In the Mishnah, there is a clause that says that you can die of it. That was like the highest discipline. So he continued to submit to Jewish discipline. He saw himself as a Jew. So I'm not saying he was a bad man, per se. But what he did in the long run was a catastrophe. And that was the main thing basically that contributed to the separation between Judaism and Christianity. I'm sorry, we are short. Yeah. Yeah.